All right, everybody. Hello and welcome. That was a little intro by Clouds, and the musicians are Floating EP. And the name of that song is Imagined Herbal Flows. So, as we move into our winter dream psychology course, we want everything to feel really flowy and move with ease throughout the course. So, just a reminder there's no requirements from you or anything that's needed. Really, this is just allow your heart, your mind, and your body to flow into new information that serves the unconscious parts of your psyche. So, as many of you know, my name is Dr. Anna Dinalo, and my background is both in education, counseling, as well as Oriental medicine. And so I hope to bring these two traditions of East and West together as we take a deeper dive into the psyche and what is suggested for this course. So let's jump in. So, some course suggestions are going to be listen to the lecture. Sometimes it's easier to treat it like a podcast and just hit play and do laundry or walk around, or sometimes the visual can be useful. So, just take some time to listen to the lecture. As well as each week, you'll want to meet with identified partner to process dreams. And this will be weekly or daily, however you're doing your journaling. And I'll also share with you some prompt questions that you can ask your partner. Another suggestion is keep a dream journal. This is going to allow you to respond to some of the weekly prompts, as well as record any images or visuals or insights that you may get throughout the course of the week. And then, of course, you can enjoy optional research articles related to dream states, etc., and exploring herbs. It's also suggested that you purchase the text called Dreams, A Portal to the Source by Whitman and Perea. They have some great ways and containers for us to analyze a dream. And Whitman and Pereira also share that altered states of consciousness and dreams are variable as nature as itself. So rather than allowing our rational mind to have this really narrow way of viewing our persona, we can allow dreams to emerge. In this textbook, we'll also talk about moving beyond a purely behavioristic viewpoint that often dismays dreams as misfiring of neurons or simply practicing, rehearsing identity roles, and take a more Freudian view that moves beyond libido conflicts and really jump in and rediscover some of Jung's basic ideas regarding dream function, as well as explore his methodology of dream interpretation. So, that textbook is available on Amazon and it will be a nice little guide as you move through the course. So let's start with who is Carl Jung? He existed on this earth from 1875 to 1961. And he was European. He was actually a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded analytical psychology. So that distinction is important because psychiatry, especially in 1890, 1899, when Jung first started exploring universities, was largely held for medical doctors who viewed any type of disease as something wrong with the body. So the most two common diseases in psychiatry at the time when he started working clinically and teaching at the university. Are you ready to guess? I know. Hysteria, and schizophrenia. So either you had one of those two conditions. And so for him to join with Freud and say, perhaps it's how you're socialized, perhaps it's your upbringing and your lived experiences that shape how someone's psychology is. So he really joined this movement of psychoanalyzing an individual, which moved beyond just seeing mental health as something wrong with the biology. So he was operating in two different disciplines. And his work has been really influential in the fields of psychiatry, anthropology, archaeology, of course, literature. He didn't identify as much with being a philosopher, even though he definitely has influenced the field of psychology, philosophy, and of course, religious studies. So he worked as a research scientist at a psychiatric hospital in Zurich. And during this time, he came to the attention of Freud and studied with him for several years. One other important thing to note about my PowerPoints as we're moving through them is that one interesting thing about me is I am dyslexic. And so it gives me this great gift of being able to write backward and forward and see the world in a very fun way. I can read very fast, but one of the drawbacks is my brain doesn't catch typos because dyslexic folk tend to pass over vowels or letters or commas and periods. So as we move throughout the PowerPoint, feel free to let me know in the chat or just if you see a typo, because I love that. And on the same note, if you see a misuse of a word or a word spelled incorrectly, I hope you can kind of enjoy the laughter of typos and synchronicity and silliness as we move forward. So I don't have a reference page for you at the end, but I do try to cite some of the sources that I'm getting this information from as we move throughout the PowerPoint. So this is coming from Carl Jung's autobiography that he published the year he died in 1961, and then it was republished in 2011, and that's called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Also a great read if you're interested. So in this memoir, he reports some of his key memories. And some attributes about him was that he was a really solitary, quiet, introverted child. And a really fun fact, like his mother, he also believed that he had two personalities, which is really kind of classic, actually, if we're looking at schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. So he believed that he had two selves. And so one he termed as a typical schoolboy, kind of living in the air, just normal. And then even in childhood at age 2, he felt like he was an influential man from the past, like way earlier than the 1800s. And in this role in his psyche, he felt very dignified and authoritative. And so he oscillated between these two extreme personalities. And although Jung was close to both parents, he reported being disappointed by his father's academic approach. And another important fact kind of about his family upbringing was that he had two siblings that died before he did, and one was a stillbirth and the other was born and then died as an infant. So him being the firstborn male to live in his family created a lot of pressure for him as well. And so this is some of the early context of fun memories that Carl Jung felt was important in his bio. Another really interesting one that stood out to me, because there's more than what I'm sharing on the slides, was that as a boy, he would carve tiny symbols to the end of his wooden ruler. So, I mean, put it in context, right? Switzerland, late 1800s, early 1900s, that's the time period he's existing in. And he would carve out from his pencil case, this ruler, and would add rocks to it, and would paint his wooden pencils and his rulers and bring tiny sheets of paper with messages inscribed on this. He also would add certain stones as a little boy and would be making these totems. And so later in life, he realized that this ceremonial act of carving out his ruler and adding stones and totems to it became this experience of both safety and inner peace, but also really a spiritual practice for him carving out his ruler. And in later years, he discovered similarities between his personal experiences and the practice associated with totems, particularly in cultures in Australia. So I thought that was really a fun aspect of his childhood, that even from a young age, he had this awareness of a sense of self that was, I mean, in modern terms or Buddhist terms, we might say that there was an awareness of a past life or a past persona that was coming in, as well as the value of these ceremonial acts. So I'll have some quotes throughout our lecture today. And one that I really appreciate is thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. And so, one of the other key hallmarks that we're going to look at today is word experiment. So that is kind of the origins of implicit bias studies that we see in the late 1960s and 70s that get really big as we're studying implicit bias related to racism and so forth. So we'll do a word experiment today. We'll also just kind of set up the context of who is Carl Jung, so that before we jump into his theories on the unconscious mind and dreaming, you kind of have a sense for the lived experience and the context of this big intellectual giant in our time. And so we'll set that up, and then we'll talk a little bit about the 3 Bardo states, and in some traditions, 6 Bardo states from Tibetan Buddhism, one of which is dreaming. So that's a little bit of your roadmap for where we're heading today. So let's jump in some more. So the impact of Carl Jung is quite astounding. And so General Eisenhower read reports Jung wrote on the unstable nature and psychotic behavior of Hitler. The Office of Strategic Services in the US even had correspondences with Carl Jung stating, nobody will probably know how much Professor Jung contributed to the Allied causes during the war. And he also was having these big discussions with folks like Albert Einstein or Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel Prize winner as well, who helped outline the structure of the atom. And this was around 1911 and onward. He was having these big conversations with big players. And it is important to note that he did have a break in the psychoanalytic community. As we talked about, psychiatry was really profound. Freud came on the stage and said, well, what if it is the person's environment that's influencing mental health? And Freud believed that that influence of the environment was by and large biological. He thought that most disorders or imbalances came from a lack of libido, and libido wasn't just sex drive, but also drive to live. And so much of the modeling, he put weight on mother and father roles as part of that socialization, where Carl Jung had this break with Freud's psychoanalysis, even though he was the top editor of the newly found International Psychoanalytic Association. The big difference here was that the central concepts of analytic psychology was individuation, and Jung considered that it wasn't sex drive or biology. There was also a piece of collective and a spiritual matter that drove humans in their teleos, or their purpose in life. So some of his key aspects and psychological concepts that were different from Freud include the concept of synchronicity, which is that things that occur naturally or in an unexpected way are often our own creation of a timeline that connects. And that can be really traced back to some of his work with physicists talking about the nature of the atom, the nature of the human. And so, actually, spoiler alert, one of the lectures I'm going to post over our 8-week course is actually going to be an interview with a few physicists to talk about this concept of synchronicity and the collective unconscious and how it's viewed from physics. So, we're going to look at that link. So again, some of his differences from Freud were synchronicity, archetypal phenomena, which is just the notion that we have archetypes that we all house within us. And if we look at astrology, we can see some of those innate imprints of archetypes and even how we're raised. So some archetypes could be queen or soldier or jester or joker. And so we'll talk as we go about archetypes and also explore those in our dream states. The other aspects that he saw was different was the concept of extroversion and introversion, and the Myers-Briggs is informed by his early work. And then he thought that the psychological complex had more of a spiritual component. So in summary, we can see some big differences between his predecessor and him. And so eventually, philosophically, they broke off. So he died in 1961, but in that time, he took hold of counterculture in Europe, in the United States, and really became loved. So in Hollywood, Brando loved Carl Jung, and it inspired in 1955, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was read by the Rolling Stones and actually inspired the concept of the shadow in Sympathy for the Devil. So if you want to go check out some old Rolling Stones music, you can be like, whoa, they were reading Carl Jung. They were enmeshed in psychoanalytic studies and psychology in the 50s and 60s. And it's actually Carl Jung who's featured on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So again, it might be fun as a little exercise just to go in and listen to some of these old albums on Spotify, or if you have CDs. I know, you're like, Anna, who has CDs? I recently found a CD and then I realized I had no capacity to play it. So maybe if you have a CD player or if you're getting really groovy, I know some of you are pretty groovy, maybe put on some old records as we're holding this container for your growth in this course. So he really infiltrated counterculture. And I think what's also really important to note about his background is that he spoke many different languages. And that's important because for certain linguistic psychology fields, what languages you speak determine how you think and even your emotional responses and how you see the world. So Vygotsky is a big proponent of this, of the language you speak totally determines how you experience the world. And a great example of this is when we look at cultures in Australia or certain indigenous communities and those languages, their sense of time is different. Some languages do not have a past and they do not have a future. So you can see that how someone thinks about the world, their concept of self, is very different from language and culture as we do that comparison. So he was reading ancient Greek, Latin, he spoke German, French, English, all Germanic languages, but he taught himself Swahili. So when he did a trip to Africa, I don't know if it was like north or south, but he was able to spend time with tribesmen and shamans and talk about their dreams. So he definitely had this really big framework linguistically that allowed him not to be so confined, even with concepts of past or future. It was more flexible. And I think another really important piece is that he believed that all humans have a central voice to our own inner ecosystem. And so that might be like, you do you, or only you know what's best. So it's this idea that while we at times look for or seek validation from the outer world, it's never going to be fully aligned with our inner ecosystem. And it's the idea that you know best and you have the final say on whatever area of life that is. You have the final say. He also believed that taking our inner voice was serious. And I have on the slide, seriously. It was very serious. So taking the inner voice serious was of the utmost importance. So to this day, you can go and see his house. It's a little museum. And of course, he lived there with his wife, Emma, and they were married in 1903. And the interesting thing actually about his wife is that she was married to a wealthy industrialist. And so I think that I believe her father, Emma's father, got his money from a watchmaking company that did luxury timepieces. And so I think it's important as well because while Carl Jung has this very colorful inner world of believing he has two personalities and personas, and then all of a sudden is in this very elite circle because of his wife, that this definitely shift how he had to put on a face or a costume um, in terms of the elites of Europe. The other important fact I want to note about this is just how much he loved this property that he was on. He would spend up to 6 months in the little castle on this slide. Let me go back. Or you know what it is. It's super cute. And he would use no running water or electricity intentionally to feel more connected with the rhythm of nature. And so this is another important aspect of Carl Jung, is that in many ways he's also heavily influenced by Taoism. And he says that he read and studied the I Ching as a spiritual practice. He drew Tibetan mandalas and thangkas. And so here's some direct quotes from him just about being in that castle, being in attune and aligned with the season. So he says, we rush impetuously into novelty. So we get so excited about new things, driven by a mounting sense of insufficiency, distraction, and restlessness. We no longer live on what we have, but on promises, no longer in the light of the present day, but in the darkness of the future, which we expect will bring us the proper sunrise. So there's this idea of rushing into novelty and it not being enough, getting the latest and greatest fancy diamond ring or new MacBook Pro, but realizing that it doesn't actually give us any life and we're living in the future of what we hope will be. He also says we refuse to recognize that everything better is purchased at the price of something worse. That, for example, the hope of greater freedom is canceled out by increased enslavement to the state, not to speak of the terrible perils to which most brilliant discoveries of science expose us. So again, in the 1900s, this memoir is written in 1961, but he's doing a lot of this writings pre and post World War I. So he's in this place of naming that everything that's purchased at the price of something worse. And the modern context I can apply this to, really, I know, and it might sound like a trite comment. Are you ready for it? It has to do with a fruit. Yeah, I believe avocado is a fruit. You can Google this and confirm, or let me know in the chat. So the avocado, it takes 18 gallons of water to grow one avocado. And if we look at certain communities and their political systems, like Argentina, water rights are given to everyone equally, meaning a large corporation, a poor farmer, and a family who doesn't have a farm but just needs bathing or drinking water can all apply for water. And often people with power get the water. So these big corporations that are doing farming because of the correct conditions in certain regions are sending those crops to China and sending them to North America, um, the Canada, USA, without realizing that it's creating an imbalance in water rights. And some communities don't have basic drinking water or water for food because all of the water is going to ship avocados to the United States. And so when we look at purchasing something, it often comes at a cost, and it may not be the cost that is worth it. So when we're looking at something as simple as importing from country to country, we still have to think of everything's origin story. And so we're applying these topics to our own psyche. So it's like that question already of, where do I refuse to recognize everything better is purchased at the price of something worse? And so we're going to be doing a deep dive into the psyche and asking ourselves these hard questions and then seeing how they emerge in our dream state. So a little more bit directly from Carl Jung. New methods or gadgets are of course impressive at first, but in the long run, they are dubious and in any case, dearly paid for. They by no means increase the contentment or happiness of people on the whole. And I think that's important. And we have to remind ourselves this is translations into English. So some of the words maybe don't flow as well. But happiness of the people on the whole, it's really referencing that collective speed, that collective aspect. He also goes on to say, mostly new methods and gadgets are deceptive sweetenings of existence. Whew, good quote, right? Deceptive sweetenings of existence. You all are going to go out and buy this book now as well because you're like, damn, this is good stuff. Like speedier communications, which unpleasantly accelerate the tempo of life and leave us with less time than ever before. And he was writing this in the 1930s. He was processing his life in the 1950s and already could see the modern issue that we're in, which is accelerating the tempo of life and it leaving us with less time than ever before. So one of his other practices, as I mentioned before, was going into his castle and staying there for months at a time with no running water and no electricity to reconnect with the cadence of life. All right, so that's our little background on Carl Jung, kind of setting us up for who is this big intellectual giant, what things did he do, and now hopefully you can be like, ah, yeah, archetypal psychology, synchronicity, unconscious mind, mover of the psychoanalytic movement in the US, first editor of that journal, and he also did word associations. And he came up with the first association experiment, which is really looking at human implicit bias. So here's an example. So we can see the word star, but when I say that, our brain has cognitive schema that attach to it. So you might think star and then have an automatic association with moon or billion or movie or glitter. And then the word glitter might make you think twinkle or cluster. And so we basically are walking around with filing cabinets in our psyche of all of these connections. And modern science even shows that what fires together wires together. So you can even think of this little diagram here with star in the center and all of these arrows pointing out as really a metaphor for a dendrite. in the brain. So things that fire together wire together. So we often take action based on this cognitive construct that gets reinforced and then stored not in short term memory, but long term memory, which is kind of like the unconscious, not even thinking about it. Where if I say, "What is your name?" you might say Rebecca. Or if I say, "First street you grew up on," you might know it really quick, but you might forget someone you met last week. And so we code things in different aspects of the brain. So today we're going to try a word association experiment for you to do a quick little assessment and see where you have some curiosities. So we're going to jump in there. But before we get there, I just want to share that this whole technique that we're about to experience together was based on 3 lectures that were delivered at the opening of Clark University in 1909. I know, isn't it fun to be trying an experiment that was done in 1909 and still holds some potency? It's so cool. And so he says, Carl Jung says, I feel like I need a German accent. I might need some help reading this. One of our students, Hazel, feel free to jump in. So here we go. When you're honored me with an invitation to lecture at Clark University, a wish was expressed that I should speak about my methods of work, especially about psychology of childhood. I hope to accomplish this task in the following manner. My first lecture will give you the viewpoints of my association methods. And in my second, I will discuss the significance of family and familiar constellations. While my third lecture shall enter more fully into the psychology of a child. So this is him really starting to unpack how family systems, how ecosystems influence how we're socialized. And before this, it was literally thought that you just had a biological dysfunction, hysteria, aka with your uterus, which we know, of course, speaks to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And so that it was seen as a brain disorder or schizophrenia. And so let's take a look at the experiment. So this is some of the experiment, and I'll just give you a moment to look through that he used, starting off first with kids. So you kind of looked at some of the words. Some of them are tree, rich, false, anxiety, big. And so he thought that this was one of the most fascinating psychological assessments because it's based on the idea that your subconscious mind is sometimes capable of controlling conscious will. And in such a single word, split second moment can unleash past traumas and even reveal unresolved internal conflicts at the split of a second. And so he believed that our conscious intentions and actions were often frustrated by unconscious processes whose very existence had a continual surprise to us as humans. So, are you ready to jump in and take a look at your own? Take a moment, grab a piece of paper, a pencil, maybe your dream journal, and we're just going to do a little tour of the buckets or areas of the human experience. So in astrology, and you all, many of you know, my bent is Vedic astrology. We're from the Vedas, from India. One of the earliest written human texts comes from India, written on a palm leaves. And there's something so beautiful about the Vedic system of looking at it, which is a square. And so today, because I kind of live in Vedic astrology, I wanted to show with you the Greek or Western system for looking at these 12 buckets of humanity. And in many cases, the Greeks took and stole a lot of artifacts from Tibetan and Hindu temples and then created their own different system. So just something fun to look into. So do you have your piece of paper and your pencil ready? Because we're going to move fast. And you may not even finish the word before I move to the next one, but you'll just kind of want to get a sense of what it is. So let's do a little practice. House. And then you might say warm. Maybe that was the first word that came to your mind. And then I might say warm, and you might say hot cocoa. And so the idea is to move fast. And if you have a hesitation beyond 3 seconds, then just put a little X by it and maybe put what your word was. So we're going to move at a fast tempo, and I invite you to just write down, even if it's not hot cocoa, maybe you just write HC just to get the word on the paper, because we're going to move through 12 words consecutively. And we're going to do them by house, starting with the first house, which is our sense of self. And in Vedic astrology, we say that every house, it's good, right? It's very good. It's very good. There's a lot of juicy things to learn. And with each of those buckets, there's going to be 100 words that are associated with that one house. And so I'm just picking one word. And so I know that it's might be a little more narrow than you're used to of a house in astrology, but just go with me for the sake of looking at some of your cognitive schema. All right, here we go. Let's jump in. Self. Personality. Money. Siblings. Home. Romance. Work. Marriage. Death. Religion. Power. Groups. Transcendence. So, how did it go? Just take a moment, look at the list. So I gave us 13, and the first house of self, we did appearance and personality, or we had 2 words. And so I want you to just take a moment and star, highlight, circle any areas that surprised you. Maybe for money, you put love, or maybe you put hate, and you're like, oh, I don't even know where that came from. I didn't know I hated money. Or maybe for marriage, you put fulfilled, or you put unknown, and you're like, I didn't think that word came out that way. And then this is going to be an opportunity to go back and explore what that little kink is. Was there a trauma there? Was there something deeper there to look at? And then just do a little jot. And this is something that you can do with a partner if you have one, or even your kiddos. Here that I have a little list for you of words for each of these houses. And you can just say, hey, we're going to go through this twice with different words, or 3 times, and let's just see how you're doing. And then it can be a really nice way to check in of like, on money you put hate. Let's unpack that. How are our finances doing, right? Whatever it might be. And it might be a nice little check-in that you can do even with a certain topic. Like, let's say if you just want to do home, parents, roots, inner security, 4th house, that will be there for you. So just these little ways for us to check in with our psyche. So I hope that was fun for you and you gleaned something new. And I hope that you'll go find a friend and give this a go on. Before I move on to the next part, just a story is coming up to share with his memoirs. One of his first clinical patients was a female, and she in the reports, it was like she looked like she had a pale face, that like black and blue under her eyes, and just completely exhausted. And so, the disorders of the time, she has hysteria. But Jung had this idea, he just had this clinical impression that there was something more to the story, and he couldn't figure out what it was. And he was talking to her and did the free association experiment. And as he moved through his various words, when it got to child, it was murdered. And then he did another series of free association, and it revealed that she unknowingly gave her daughter water that had typhoid in it. So the whole town where they existed, again, the ecology, like the ecosystems, impact health, not just in a biology, but in a psychology of a human. And so they knew that nobody could use this drinking water, and she accidentally gave it to her son, who was 9, and to her younger daughter, and it killed her younger daughter. And just before that had happened, her husband had realized that a really wealthy, good-looking person in her small town wanted to marry her, and she had already married someone else and had kids. And so that sent her into a spiral. And then this happened with her daughter, which sent her into more of a spiral. So he used this to illuminate some things that were more complex. And when brought to the surface, she was able to recall that she did, in fact, give her daughter water that had typhoid in it. And so this was a big pivot point for him as he started to do more research on associations and these word experiments to understand our cognitive schemas. So just a fun little backstory. It was a mom, and the word murderous came out. So I don't know what you're going to find if you do these with your friends. we'll have to see. You guys can send me an email of your story. Okay, so there's research nowadays, modern century, that are still researching these early concepts. So implicit bias suggests that some people can act on the basis of prejudice or stereotypes, even if you don't mean to. So you might be wondering, like, what's an example of that? And so when we look at African American health in the US, they often are not likely to get the same treatment in a hospital setting as white counterparts. And you might say, why? Because of implicit bias. An example from my personal life and my friend group, I have a friend who is actually Latina, but she looks very dark and Afro-Cubano. And at the hospital, even though she had her wedding ring on, and she asked that her husband would come into the room, on her paperwork, it got written that she was a single mom who had never had a child. It was her second child. She was married. She was wearing a wedding ring during the entire intake, and he wasn't able to get in the room in time for the delivery. Whew, right? That is like the example of implicit bias. Someone put on medical forms, single mother, no guests, can come in, sign, and miss the birth. So even though we think, oh, like, I don't mean to be racist, it can happen implicitly, even to really kind, beautiful folks, just based on how you're socialized. So much of the work we're doing in this class is exciting because, yes, we're going to get into some cool dream states, but we're also doing social justice work, because as we're able to do self-study and see our own shadows, then we're able to impact the collective shadow who's not willing to look at all of the lurking, unhealthy aspect of self. So really, the shadow is kind of where we put the devil. And we have to ask, where do we allow darkness to be housed? And often we can see it through racism and bigotry. And so Gary Boboff, a psychoanalytic author, says, racism and bigotry offer the relief of foisting our group's shadow onto another whom we view as lesser. Doing so enables us to not look at or feel our shadow and even see our worst self. But the collective shadow of modern culture is also bigger and wider than any group to group projection. There are culture wide, civilization wide expressions of the collective shadow. And I really love that quote from Bob Arf, and we're gonna talk about that next week as we look at the shadow side. But I just think it's really important that we also see that distinguishing factor of not just individual cognitive schema and biases, aka word experiment, but also looking at our collective, our anthropologic collective shadow. So, this article quote that I have up here by Bronstein goes on to say, while psychologists in the field of implicit social cognition study consumer product self-esteem, food, alcohol, political values, and still the most striking well-known research has been focused on how implicit bias often tends toward socially stigmatized groups such as African Americans, women, and LGBTQ populations. Whew. So, we're unpacking that implicit bias that every one of us has. So, let's jump into some key terms. I hope this PowerPoint makes you smile. Yeah. I don't know why. It was such a good film. I hope everyone's seen it. I'm not even one for like Netflix or TV, but the undertones were so fun of looking at how it was, a Latin American, a Spanish speaking family who could be so dark and gothy. That was a fun juxtaposition. And then also just looking at the collective trauma that contributed to her expression and distaste with the world in very unhealthy ways. And so in the Netflix special, I feel like I'm promoting it. I'm like, everyone should go see it. She says about her brother, she says to Uncle Fester, I hope he gets a complex. And it just made me really happy. And I laughed out loud. It was like, yay, a complex. Because all of these psychoanalytic terms postulated by Carl Jung, what a master. Like, this is like Carl Jung is like Buddhahood in my book. Like, you literally named a terminology a complex and it made its way all the way to Netflix in 2023. That's wild. Like, Carl Jung has impacted some stuff. So, as we talked about, the word experiment is a test devised by Jung, which reveals the existence of autonomous complexes within the psyche. All right, then. So, how do we define complexes? The complex is a feeling tone. Feeling tone, that's important. So, maybe like when you go into, my brain just went here, a strip club, the feeling tone might be shameful or uncomfortable, and you don't maybe have a specific feeling of like, I'm angry to be here or I'm jealous. It might just be a general tone, even just like looking at a building. I was recently home in New Mexico and off of I-40. As a child, I would always notice um, a, a restaurant or bar called TD. So T and D. And always tried to like understand what that would even be like. There's a feeling tone in my psyche about a strange place from the past. So, feeling tone is psychic energy that operates on its own. You're not trying to create a feeling about it, it's just there. So, a feeling tone, Wendy Adams' wish her brother might have, is feeling left out or feeling shamed. And so, a center of psychic energy. There we go. And so, again, some of these terminologies are coming from Bob Roth's book, who I absolutely love as well. Some more terms as we continue. The unconscious is a layer of psychic functioning below the threshold of what we perceive in our waking states, aka consciousness, and the matrix out of which the ego and self-awareness emerges. So cool. So where the ego comes out of, which is a matrix, is going to be the unconscious mind. We're not aware of it, and that's where it's birthed from, is our unawareness, the parts of us that are a bit more hidden. And then complexes and other centers of energy exist in the unconscious as well. And I'm going to show you a map of that in just a moment. So visuals coming if you're a visual learner. And then also another key term is just symbolic or symbology. Nature of the psyche is that the unconscious produces symbolic images. This is really important for our dream course. We're setting this all up that redirect our psychic energy, bringing together conscious and unconscious materials and produce lessening of conflict. So that's the idea of how can I lessen conflict? So perhaps you grew up in a home where you felt like you had to walk on eggshells around parent, mother, dad, non-binary parent. So the unconscious material gets stored, trying to lessen conflict. And then I will let all my German fluent students read this word. Yeah, I don't know how to say it. I mean, I could Google it and get back with you all. But this word is the attribute towards life, which contributes to our psychological health and is rooted in both consciousness and the unconscious mind. So this is all about our whole totality of life. And I'm going to Google that. And we can all take a pause and Google. And if you already know how to say it, then you're like, yeah, you're like, come on. Okay, so you all ready? And let's see if you can hear this.
Weltanschauung.
I knew that.
Weltanschauung.
Weltanschauung is attribute towards life. Okay, so dreams give access to these different parts of the psyche. So here's the map, I promise. I'm just gonna type in here map. Maps or spam, right? In reverse. Isn't that kind of fun? And that's just how my brain works. When you're dyslexic, you see everything backwards. It's interesting. Okay, so let's take a look. So we can see that there is the map, and you maybe want to draw it in your notes. It's a nice time to do a little sketch here. We have the outer world, which is how we're perceived, and that's often in astrology, like the fourth house, the seventh, fourth house of home, seventh of relationship, 10th house of job, first house of self. Those are things that the outer world sees. And then in our inner world, that's more like the second house, how we feel about our nourishment or our money, and perhaps daily routines or creative arts, the fifth house, the sixth, or even perhaps our sexual life. Is it really vibrant and colorful and safe, or is it really dark or shut off? So we also have the inner world, other places that folks don't necessarily know, the 12th house of our psychic intuition, the 12th house of the dreamer. That's our inner world. So in this course, we're working to build up a beautiful inner garden, and not just garden, but like straight up, y'all, mansion, a beautiful mansion with a room for you to read, a room with luxurious, elegant spa and nature, bath salts, just everything that makes you feel juicy in that inner world. So that's what we're cultivating through our dream work. So we can see that there's also on this map personal and unconscious. And we can see that there's the collective and the personal. So self is right at the center. So let's start from the inside. Self, and then we have ego, which emerges from the unconscious. And we have shadow that also lives in the unconscious. And then persona is how we want the world to see us. It's our best face forward. It's kind of like if you were socialized to go to any type of religious upbringing, like maybe if you were Christian or Catholic, you went to church on Sundays and you dressed up, or perhaps certain types of synagogue, you put a face, right, to how you look to the outer community. And then that's the persona, where our shadow is where we store all of the unconscious material that's difficult to digest. So it's basically the part of us that's aggressive or ugly or mean And we all have that part. So it's kind of where the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde part of us lives. And then we have the animus and animi, which actually for Jung just translated to the soul. But he believed that there in the soul was this gender expression of that which is feminine and that which is masculine. So that's why it's the animus and animi. So just a recap, we have the self, the ego, and the shadow, both in the unconscious. And then in the outer layer of that, we have the persona and our soul, the animus animi, and then the outer world and inner world. The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanction of the soul. Ooh, those are some words. How do they land with you? A dream is a hidden door somewhere in that map we just looked at. It's a little doorway in. And it's the most intimate sanctum of the soul. So again, we're just cultivating this really beautiful inner garden, this place where you know best and you have the final say because there's this strong alignment with self. All right, here's where we get juicy. Here's where we get juicy. What is your intention for this course? Is there something in this new year? It's a Chinese New Year. You're the water rabbit. Is there something that you're going to hold space for? Maybe you just had a baby. Maybe you're going to have a baby. Maybe you just started a new job. Maybe you're going to leave a job. What is your intention? And you don't have to know that right now, but we're definitely going to do some intention settings. And then how can I analyze dreams that support this implicit bias we all have? So we're supporting the uncovering of that bias, right? Maybe you're like, I need to stop buying avocados. I know I had the same thought, but then it was like, maybe I will just buy less or make sure that I don't let one get brown. I really appreciate it. So what are some deeper things that you're unpacking as far as your own ecosystem, really getting to the heart of things? How can dreams support your individuation? Yeah, your individuation, because individuation takes a while, right? We're socialized to be a gender by age 2 or 3. You're female, you're male. It's the traditional story. Boys go to this bathroom, girls go to that. Boys are stronger and athletic, and girls are not, right? I mean, that's been a story. I'm not saying it's the right one by any means, but that's been how many of us have been socialized, that we can't have a middle or a queer or a non-binary place. It's right or left. Left-handed children corrected in school to be right-handed children. And then by high school, right, there's a certain persona to fit into. Are you too tall? Are you too short? Are you too fat? Are you too thin? Are you too pretty? Are you not pretty enough? There's so much training and socialization by the time you get to high school, and then throw in the socialization of organized religion and power dynamics of you're not Christian if you do this, you're not Jewish enough if you do that. There's so much conditioning. How to be in your family, how to be at work, in a capital system and society. Individuation is shedding all of those layers like a snake. Just, it's painful, but it has to be done. individuation is you taking both feet in the ground and not saying, who do I have to be? Who am I now? Not who should I be or who do my parents want me to be? But what is my true nature? Individuation. That's a big one, shedding layers. And just asking, are you open to exploring the unconscious mind? It may give you answers you don't like, right? Maybe you realize that you hate money in the free association experiment. It might surprise you. Whew, I know, it's a lot to take in. So again, what's your intention for the course? How can analyzing dreams support you in uncovering any bias? How do dreams support your individuation? And are you open to this exploration? So before we even go further into encouraging dreaming and writing the dreams down, I want to invite you to set that intention in a word. This course for me is going to be peace of mind, or this course is going to be intellectual growth, or it's going to be quiet, my quiet time. Set that intention, and then let's move forward.
Weltanschauung.
Yeah, I played it for you guys again.
Weltanschauung.
But the question is, do you remember what it means? If you don't, you're going to have to go back and review some of your lecture notes. Okay, so we're going to conclude with a little conversation about Bardo states and some dream journaling prompts. So the Tibetan word Bardo translates to as gap, interval, intermediate state, and transitional processes. And it often refers to the gap in between lives. So we're creating context. So I'm talking about Nepal and China. And as we're looking at the emergence of Tibetan Buddhism and this reference to the Bardos, we're really giving a framework here of a Buddhist philosophy or a Taoist philosophy. So this class is really open to people of a variety of backgrounds and religious or spiritual beliefs. And you don't have to believe this. It's just rather looking at the perspective of Tibetan teachings and this idea of intermediary states. And this is something that inspired Carl Jung as he, in many of his art pieces around his home and his sculptures and carvings, were Tibetan mandalas. And so we'll look at those a bit more as well. So there are primarily three types of bardos. The painful bardo of dying, so the moment of when you get sick, sometimes it can be 14 days, 5 days while you're suffering. The luminous bardo of dharmata, and karmic bardo of becoming. So we can see that there's these there's three states, which are often depicted in Tanka, so that's what this is. And while in the bardo, between life, death, and the consciousness of the deceased can still apprehend words, prayers spoken on its behalf, which can help it navigate the confusion to be reborn into an existence that is a greater chance of enlightenment. So there's this idea that we prepare for this in-between state where we can still apprehend aspects from the unconscious mind and access that in the Buddhist tradition before reincarnating. So getting closer to enlightenment. And in some Buddhist monks, they believe that if you start meditation practices, if you start some of these mantras and connection with these images, that in a lifetime you can move towards this attainment of Buddhahood, which is just inner peace of radiant qualities, aka enlightenment. So there's various states of consciousness, And as we mentioned before, it's this two different planes. And there's usually the sequence of degeneration just after death and being spiritually capable to navigate the sometimes terrifying hallucinations that can come from our own cause and effect. And so this is by the William Osler Health System, just looking at these. In addition to the three Bardo states, there can also be six in some traditions. And this is where our dream psychology comes in. So Fermentel states that there's traditionally six original Bardos state, the Bardos of this life, of meditation. So the Bardo of this life, like right now, we're all in a dream together. We're all not just in dream psychology in a real way, little matrixy here, but we are also in a class, which is a dream. And then we have the Bardos of meditation, the Bardo of dying, existence, and dream. So dream state becomes in Tibetan Buddhism its own sacred place to practice Buddhahood, to practice enlightenment, so that there's an alignment in the other states of consciousness. So in a way, it's really cool because there's also a lot of opportunity to practice alignment in all states of consciousness. So as we begin to record our dreams, to connect with them, to set intentions before we engage in our dream, which is defined as lucid dreaming, it's important to remember that no dream symbol can be separated from the individual who dreams it. And there's no definite or straightforward interpretation of any dream. So we're not going to separate it from the individual, and we have to keep it in context of that human. So each dream can be seen as a widening of self-awareness. So I'll invite you to try to recall your dreams every day. The best time to recall dreams is right when you wake up, they're fresh. And so consider keeping a dream diary by your bedside, maybe under the bed. And also when you jot down your dreams, you might jot down things like a symbol. There was a cross on the wall when I dreamt about my mom, and the cross was really clear. I have an association with that metal cross being in my mom's room on the left side wall. So just symbols, associations. Dreaming can also help consolidate memory, skills, daily habits. You might dream about what you did before, or something coming up at a board meeting or work, or something with your kids. So it can also be kind of practicing daily habits. And there's still this pragmatic view that dreaming is just a biological function, and that is true as well, right? We dream for mood states, and we secrete certain enzymes in the body at different hours. So yes, but dreams can also offer diagnosis, prognosis, and appropriate material to address the dreamer's current psychology and the reality by illuminating one's own blind spot of consciousness. So again, absolutely, there's a biology to dreaming. We'll talk about that a little more next week. But also, each dream offers diagnosis and prognosis about our current psychological reality. So really useful as a check-in. So dream entries can include time in bed, wake time, feeling tones throughout the day or week, herbs that you might be working with, maybe mugwort or chamomile, infused oils. And then you can also include where you are on your moon cycle, like actual moon cycle. We're heading into Aquarius. And so in that cycle, you might want to talk about, is it a full moon? Is it waning? Is it waxing? And also include hormone cycles. So important because hormone cycles will impact how you're dreaming. So just checking in, are you a few days before you may bleed? Are you ovulating? All of that's great info as well. And then you're invited to include the dream prompt question for the week or day. And so I'm going to give you a little hint. The prompt for this week. Yep, I hear you doing a drum roll. Thank you very much. The prompt for the week. and just building suspense, is how do I feel safe? So just write that down. How do I feel safe? And before you go to bed, you want to review what's the intention in this container we're in this 8 weeks we have together. And then you're also going to want to include how do I feel safe? And so you can write out a few sentences or journal, or you can just tuck that question under your pillow and sleep with it for a few weeks. Another question you might want to include are what things make me feel triggered? What things make me feel grounded? And so you can take any of these questions. I trust you, just what resonates for you, but we're really focusing on a root here. What makes us feel safe? And then you might want to include a season or date. Winter Dream Course. All right, so that is all I have for you. I hope that it was a good first week starting off, and you have a bit more background related to who's Carl Jung, what was his impact. I hope that you also enjoyed looking at some free association and the word experiment. And lastly, I hope that some of the discussions just on looking at the dream state as a Bardo state, as a place where we can create alignment in our waking world, and just exploring some of those views from Buddhism. I hope all of that was useful for you. And as you dream and journal this week, the question is what makes you feel safe? Online, you'll see a little handout and the prompt for the week. Under research or articles on the website, you'll also see some links to read on about different herbs you can work with for dream time. So I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will talk to you all soon.